All right, so today we're really diving deep into the Bible, or, well, more like biblical history,
Mm,
and like how much of it actually lines up with what we know from, like actual history.
right.
We're using this book. It's called Playing God by David Fitzgerald. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah, yeah. He really goes deep on how ancient religions, actually got started.
Which is fascinating when you think about it. Like these ancient cultures, they're trying to explain the world, right?
Right, and they've got shamans and sacrifices.
Hmm.
The Egyptians, man, those guys were, obsessed with the stomach.
It's wild, but like Fitzgerald says, it's not that they were less intelligent than us.
No, no, not at all. Just working with, totally different information.
Exactly. It's like imagine explaining a smartphone to someone from like 1,000 years ago. They'd freak out.
Totally. But then, think about the Pacific Islanders, right? They had this amazingly accurate system of astronomy.
And they figured it out, what, just by looking up.
Pretty much. It shows
Oh,
you,
no.
we can't underestimate how clever these ancient cultures were.
No, for sure. But, and this is big but, we're working with like such a tiny fraction of the actual evidence.
Right. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle with, half the pieces missing.
Exactly. And then on top of that, it's like who's doing the writing?
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
It's always the winners, right? The kings, the priests.
So we're getting this very like top-down view of history.
Exactly. We're missing the voices of, the everyday people, the farmers, the craftspeople.
And that's got to skew things, right? Like imagine trying to understand our world through like only Instagram influencers.
Right. You'd get a very distorted picture, wouldn't you?
Totally. And that's what we're going to be digging into today. How do we fill in those gaps? And what happens when the Bible's version of history, well, doesn't quite match up?
Yeah, that's the big question.
So we're talking like potential plot holes in the Bible.
Well, maybe not plot holes exactly.
Okay, sure. But like places where the traditional story, the one everyone knows, maybe doesn't quite line up with what we're finding out through archaeology and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. And honestly, some big ones when you think about it. Like take the Exodus, right?
Hmm.
Huge deal. Foundational to so much of the Bible.
Yeah. Moses parting the Red Sea, the whole bit.
Exactly. But when you go looking for the archaeological evidence for this mass migration out of Egypt, it's just not there.
See, that's what gets me. You'd think with all those people wandering the desert for decades.
You'd think there'd be something, right?
Exactly. Footprints, lost sandals, something.
Right. I mean, that's what makes it so puzzling. And it gets even more interesting when you think about, the political situation back then. Egypt was at the height of its power. They controlled everything. Not exactly the best time to plan a mass escape.
Okay, true. And it wasn't just a quick getaway, right? The plagues, the
Well, it's
miracles.
all a bit hard to square with what we know about that period.
Okay, all right. So, Exodus. Maybe not so clear-cut. But what about, like, Joshua conquering Canaan? Another big epic story.
Right. Military victory, establishing the promised land, the whole 9 yards. And again, the archaeology tells a different story. We don't see evidence of this massive conquest, the destruction that the Bible describes.
So what? It was all, like, exaggerated,
Well,
made up?
not necessarily. It might just be that the process was a lot more gradual, more complex, more like different groups migrating, mixing over a long time.
So less of a hostile takeover, more of a, like, slow integration.
Exactly. It's just a different way of looking at it.
Okay, so I've got these two huge stories, the Exodus, the conquest, and both of them kind of shaky ground, historically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's putting it simply, but you get the idea.
So are we saying, like, toss out the Bible, it's all unreliable?
No, 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 not at all. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Right? The Bible is.
Hmm.
It's complicated.
How do you mean?
Well, remember, it wasn't written all at once, right? It's a collection of texts, written, edited, compiled over centuries.
Okay, right, like a religious anthology almost.
Exactly. And Fitzgerald makes this point that it's more helpful to think of it not as a straight history book, but like a tapestry.
A tapestry.
Yeah, like a woven together from different threads. History, mythology, theology, all mixed in.
Okay, I can see that. So it's not about taking everything literally, but more about, like, understanding the bigger picture, the message.
Right. And one of the things Fitzgerald talks about is, the Bible uses these recurring phrases, these formulaic expressions, almost like literary building blocks.
Huh. So, like, they were reusing and adapting earlier material.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that you find similar phrases in Babylonian texts, which actually predate the Bible.
Wait, hold on. Babylonian connection again. First, the flood story. Now this.
It's all connected. You got to remember, the ancient Near East, it was like this big melting pot of ideas.
Hmm.
Cultures bumping up against each other, borrowing, adapting.
So, like the Bible's authors, they weren't just writing in a vacuum, they were drawing on all these older traditions.
Exactly. Reworking them, fitting them into their own worldview.
Which makes you wonder how many other Bible stories maybe had their start somewhere else entirely, right?
Oh, for sure. And it adds this whole other layer to how we understand these stories.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so think about Noah's Ark. Everyone knows that
The
one.
flood, the animals,
Mhm.
yeah.
Right. But the details, when you really get into it,
Yeah.
the geography, the animals, it actually lines up better with Mesopotamia than Israel. Plus, there's this whole other flood myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh from Babylon, and it's way older.
So are you saying Noah's Ark, it's a Babylonian ripoff?
I wouldn't say rip off exactly, more like an adaptation, a reimagining.
Okay, sure. But still, how much of the Bible is like truly original? And how much is borrowed, adapted, remixed?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question, and scholars are still debating it.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but you don't know which pieces go where.
Exactly. But that's part of what makes it so fascinating. It's about digging deeper, looking for those connections, understanding the historical and literary context.
Okay, all right. So we've talked about the Exodus, the conquest, even Noah's Ark. What about the big names, though? David, Solomon. Surely there's solid proof for those guys, right?
Ah, now we're getting to the good stuff.
Yeah.
The Bible paints them as these larger-than-life figures, right? Powerful kings, vast empire, all the wealth and glory you can imagine.
Diamonds, palaces, peacocks, the works.
Exactly. But the archaeological evidence, well, let's just say it paints a slightly different picture.
What? You're telling me King David, maybe not so magnificent after all?
Well, there's a lot of debate. Some archaeologists think that if David existed, which some even questioned his kingdom was probably a lot smaller, a lot less impressive than the Bible makes out.
Hold up, you mean like we're talking less King David, more like Dave from down the road?
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
But still a far cry from the glorious king of the Bible.
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
There's this great quote from a couple of archaeologists, Finkelstein and Silberman. They said the archaeology was wrong because it doesn't match up with the Bible's grand narrative.
It's like finding Cinderella's glass slipper, but no Cinderella.
Exactly. And speaking of Cinderella, the Bible plays up that whole rags to riches story with David, right? Shepherd boy becomes king.
Classic underdog story.
Right. But then it also throws in all these other details, these conflicting origin stories, hints at a miraculous birth. It's almost like they were trying to have it both ways.
To make him even more legendary, you think?
Maybe. Or maybe it reflects these different traditions, different versions of David's life that got woven together.
So not a simple, straightforward biography then?
It's never simple, is it? And it gets to this whole question of authorship. Because it's very possible that the Bible, as we have it, is the product of multiple authors, editors, each with their own perspective, their own spin on things.
So it's like instead of one author, it's more like a whole team of writers in a writer's room coming up with different drafts, revisions.
Exactly. And that's why it's so tricky. We're trying to uncover all these different voices, these different layers of interpretation that went into creating this text.
Okay, so we've been like really picking apart these Bible stories, seeing where they might not be, historically accurate. But there's this other thing, right? The Bible, it's always pushing monotheism. One God, that's it.
Right.
But then it's also full of mentions of other gods, like all over the place. So how does that work?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the more interesting contradictions. You've got this condemnation of worshiping other gods, but they're everywhere, woven right into the text.
So it's like they were trying to write them out of the story, but they kept creeping back in.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And maybe it shows that, like, moving from polytheism to monotheism, it wasn't this clean break.
Right, like more of a process maybe, with some bumps along the way.
Exactly. And the archaeology seems to back that up. Plus, the Bible itself kind of hints at it. There's this idea of a much more fluid religious landscape.
You mean like people mixing and matching their beliefs?
In a way, yeah. Different gods, different traditions, all kind of coexisting.
Huh. Which brings us to those elephantine papyri. Right. What were those again?
Oh, man. Those are wild. They're these ancient Jewish texts found in Egypt. And get this, they describe a whole Jewish community worshiping Yahweh, but also other gods.
Hold on, wait. They were cool with, like, worshiping multiple gods and still considered themselves Jewish?
Seems that way. And it gets even wilder. They were seemingly cool with Jerusalem, too, which was like the center of Jewish worship back then.
Whoa. So this wasn't just some, like, fringe group. This was legit.
Seems like it. Which really challenges how we think about Jewish monotheism, right? It might have been a lot more flexible than we tend to think.
Makes you wonder what else we've done wrong, right?
Oh, totally. And it's not just the elephantine papyri. Remember those sun god connections we were talking about?
Oh, yeah, right. Like the Bible's always railing against sun worship.
Exactly. But then you've got Samson, whose name literally means sun. And the whole story, the hair, the strength, the blinding, it's all classic sun god stuff.
So they were condemning it, but also kind of using it.
It's almost like they were trying to fit these older familiar stories into this new monotheistic framework, even if it meant some contradictions along the way.
Like they couldn't quite shake those older traditions.
Exactly. And then you've got all those verses about how bad star worship is. Why even mention it if it wasn't a real thing people were doing? It's like these other beliefs were a real presence.
It's fascinating though, right? It's like you can track these shifts in religious thought just through the stories they tell.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of shifts, what about Satan? Talk about an evolution.
Right. Starts as this angel, then turns into like public enemy number one.
Right. It's a pretty big demotion, cosmically speaking.
No kidding. But it makes you think. Like, did the concept of evil itself change over time?
Totally. In the early parts of the Bible, Satan's more like God's prosecuting attorney. But then he becomes this embodiment of evil, this cosmic force opposing God.
So the idea of evil got bigger, scarier, maybe more defined as time went on.
Exactly. It's this really fascinating example of how religious ideas evolve, how they adapt to the changing world.
So we've got the stories, we've got the archaeology, we've got these evolving ideas about God, about evil. But what about the Bible itself? Who wrote this thing and when?
Ah, the million-dollar question. And honestly, one that scholars have been debating for centuries, but one thing that seems pretty clear. The Bible, it wasn't written all at once. It's more like a collection of texts written and compiled over hundreds of years.
Which kind of explains why there's all these contradictions and weird bits, right?
Exactly. And Fitzgerald talks about something called the documentary hypothesis. Basically, it says that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, they were actually combined from 4 different sources.
Whoa, hold up. 4 different sources.
Each one had its own perspective, its own agenda, even its own style.
So it's less like one author, more like a band writing an album together.
Exactly.
Mm.
And then on top of that, you've got editors, redactors, all these other hands shaping the text into what we have now.
It's like a game of telephone, but with Holy Scripture.
Right. And to make things even more interesting, some scholars think the Torah wasn't finalized until, like, centuries after the events it describes.
Seriously. So we're talking like major time lag.
Yeah, it's a radical idea, but it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, there's no physical evidence for a lot of the big stuff. The Exodus, Moses.
So if Moses might not have even existed, where does that leave, like the 10 Commandments, all that?
Good question. And it's one that's sparking a lot of debate. If the Exodus didn't happen as described, then where did those laws and traditions come from? Did they evolve gradually? Were they borrowed from other cultures? It's a real head-scratcher.
It's like the Bible is this giant jigsaw puzzle, but someone lost half the pieces and mixed in pieces from another puzzle entirely.
And it hit the instruction manual.
Yeah.
But that's part of the fun, right? Trying to figure out how it all fits together.
Okay, true. But it also makes you wonder, like, if we're questioning all this stuff, the authorship, the timeline, even the sources, what does that mean for how we read the Bible today?
It means we have to be open to new interpretations, new ways of understanding this ancient text.
So less like a history textbook, more like a, I don't know, a conversation starter.
Exactly. The Bible, it's full of profound insights, incredible stories, ethical dilemmas that are still relevant today. But it's also important to remember, it's a product of its time. It was shaped by human hands, human interpretations, human biases.
So how do we even begin to navigate all that? Where do we even start?
I think the most important thing is to keep an open mind. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to think critically, to embrace the mystery. The more we understand about the Bible's past, the richer our understanding of it becomes.
It's like instead of taking it as this, like, absolute truth, we can appreciate it for what it is. This incredible tapestry of history, mythology, faith.
Absolutely. And remember, this deep dive, it's just the beginning. There's a whole world of scholarship, debate, and discovery out there. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been amazing.